It's just a rip-off, a fucking rip-off of death metal with breakdowns and simplistic riffs.
What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock NBA, and today we're talking about deathcore. Deathcore is a genre that I once loved. Back in like 2009, 2010, I was all about it. But now, not so much. And judging by the numbers, I'm not the only one. The genre is way down since its commercial peak in 2014. As you can see from this chart here, which I'm going to explain in this video. So what happened? In this video, I'm going to do my very best to explain, and I'm going to break down that whole chart in excruciating detail, so stay tuned. But first, a couple things I want to plug. Number one, the Punk Rock NBA podcast is out now on all podcast platforms. There's a link to that in the description. Number two, if you want to support the show, you can do that on Patreon. Patrons get access to a bunch of benefits, like getting the podcast a week early. There's also a link to that in the description. And also, because lots of you have asked for it, I did make a playlist for this video. Also a link to that in the description. And with that out of the way, let's get into it.
I'm gonna do a rant on deathcore and, seeing kids.
First up, setting the stage from roughly 1996 to 2003 or so. I've talked about this in a ton of other videos, so I'm not going to go too much into detail, but basically the thing to understand is that back in the 80s and 90s, hardcore and metal did not really cross streams the way that they do now. But that all changed thanks to bands like Earth Crisis and VOD and Integrity, and by the mid-90s, metallic hardcore had completely taken over. But with that said, the marriage of hardcore and metal was still pretty young, and hardcore kids honestly had pretty narrow taste in metal. Basically just like the standard entry-level bands like Metallica and Slayer and Sepultura. Maybe if they were like really adventurous, Prong or Fear Factory or something. So there was a little bit of that, but hardcore and death metal on the other hand, pretty much zero overlap there. That probably sounds weird to hear if you're younger and you only know today when every hardcore kid worships Obituary and Entombed, but that's just the way it was back then. That said, I did slowly find out that there are a few exceptions to that. For example, my friend Mike Seatown was one of the only people back then in hardcore that was into real death metal. There were a few bands that tried to combine the two, and I think really laid the foundation for what we would later come to call deathcore. I'm pretty sure the very first band to call themselves deathcore was a band called Darkside NYC, who were doing that way back in like 92, 93. But they were drawing more from like Celtic Frost, that kind of thing. I think the real fusion of like more modern death metal and hardcore started to come out of the vegan, straight edge, and hardline scene in like the mid to late 90s. For example, Upheaval from Indianapolis, Day of Suffering from North Carolina, and my personal favorite, Abnegation from Erie. That was the more brutal side of things, which has always been my preference, but there were also some bands that were starting to experiment with the fusion of melodic death metal and hardcore. As I've said before, I don't personally like melodic death metal, but I do have to give these guys credit for being years and years ahead of the curve on this trend. There must have been something in the water in North Carolina back then, because along with Day of Suffering, who I mentioned before, there was also Prayer for Cleansing, with a couple guys who would go on to be in Between the Buried and Me. And Undying, also pre-Between the Buried and Me. There was also Unearth, who as far as I'm aware, were the very first band to do the whole like chugs of sweet picking thing that would go on to pretty much like take over the entire genre 10 years later. Band that was completely slept on at the time. I only knew one other person that had ever even heard of this band back then, but they were doing something that I think was probably the closest thing to modern deathcore way back in 1998, Embodiment. And of course, down in Orange County, you had 18 Visions, who you probably know for their fashion core stuff, but their early stuff is heavy as shit. So you had all these bands all over the country kind of experimenting with this death metal meets hardcore thing, but I think it was just kind of bubbling below the surface. Like, it wasn't really a thing. None of these bands were particularly popular, even within the hardcore scene. I think it wasn't until a few years later that it really started to hit critical mass.
Now, deathcore is fucking horrible. It's not good music. It's just a ripoff, a fucking ripoff of death metal with breakdowns and simplistic riffs.
Which brings us to what I'm calling the deathcore 1.0 era from roughly 2003 to 2006. This is when I felt like a new scene was really starting to emerge that was its own thing. It wasn't really part of hardcore, it wasn't really part of metal, it was something new. As you can see from the chart, there's a few things that started to change in this era. For one, in addition to the hardcore kids that were part of the previous generation, this is when you started to see the earliest examples of scene kids come in. And also MySpace. As that site started to get big, a lot of newer bands were taking advantage of it, especially these guys. And as far as commercial success, well, there really wasn't any. Anyhow, in the past when I've talked about like the deathcore 1.0 era, I've used that term to refer to what I like semi-jokingly call at the gates core. Basically all the bands that combine like melodic death metal riffs and vocals with breakdowns. There were a ton of these bands, but a few of the most notable ones would be like All Shall Perish, As Blood Runs Black, or early Bring Me the Horizon. But thinking about it now, I actually think that although At the Gates core was definitely the dominant flavor of it at the time, there were a couple other styles popping up around that era that would actually kind of foreshadow where the genre was gonna go. First of all, you had like the slow, sludgy, down-tempo kind of sound that really nobody was doing back then, but has become super popular since then. I would definitely credit the Acacia strain with pioneering that. Aside from the production, I don't know, I think that song sounds like remarkably modern for being almost 20 years old. And a second, the more technical style, like the Red Chord, Despised Icon, Glass Casket, and Ion Dissonance, or as they say, Ion Dissonance. And then there were the bands that to me felt a little bit more influenced by hardcore than metal, for example, Dead to Fall or early Animosity. These bands had the technical ability of metal. They could play way, way better than pretty much any hardcore band could ever dream of. But yet they still had the rawness and aggression of hardcore, and they were attracting an audience that was also kind of somewhere between those two worlds. You saw a lot more like metal kids with long hair showing up than you would at a hardcore show, but they weren't your standard issue metal kids. They were, I guess for lack of a better word, kind of a little bit more geeky and smart than the people you would expect to see at a typical death metal show back then.
I wrestled the bear once in Whitechapel and all that fucking shit. It's not even riffs, it's just scratching on the guitar like
Which brings us to the next phase, the deathcore 2.0 era from roughly 2007 to 2010, and what I think of as the golden era of deathcore. Looking at the chart here, you can see some of the key developments in this era. The main one being that it was now pretty much exclusively for MySpace scene kids. The hardcore roots of the culture were pretty much gone, but it was still definitely not accepted within the metal scene. And that's what made it so cool to me. It was by the kids, for the kids. Just like the metalcore boom that was happening around the same time, or the emo rap thing that happened a couple years later, the older people and media gatekeepers hated it. And anytime there's something going on where the kids love it but the gatekeepers hate it, to me that's a sign that something cool is happening. The dominant style here is what I call brutalcore, like the Brutal Kids. And yes, it is important to spell it with the zeros, just like the MySpace kids did. The big bands there would be Job For A Cowboy, Whitechapel, Carnifex, Chelsea Grin, and of course, the kings of this whole era, Suicide Silence. Basically, these were just bands trying to play the heaviest shit they possibly could, which typically meant a lot of blast beats, a lot of gutturals, and of course, lots and lots of breakdowns.
You ready? You ready for the fucking breakdown? You guys are ready for this goddamn breakdown, right? Yeah!
Those are all great bands, don't get me wrong, but the stuff that really holds a special place in my heart is all the like second or third tier bands that objectively weren't as good as those top tier bands. Definitely rough around the edges in a lot of ways, but it has that just like pure, sincere, youthful energy that is what drew me to punk and hardcore in the first place. I could go on about this stuff forever. I'll limit it to just a few. My single favorite release of this whole era, hands down, is Demolisher's World of Hatred EP. And second, the Jerome demo, especially the song Eat the Gun. And if you like those guys, check out some of the members' new band, Vile Secretion. And related, the Monsters EP, which I think has some members of Jerome. I could be wrong about that, but either way, this is an absolute gem. I still listen to this all the time.
Holy shit!
And there's way more bands that I could possibly list here, so please don't do the like, you failed to mention so-and-so thing in the comments. But a few other bands to check out if you're into this stuff would be Molotov Solution, Salt the Wound, Disfiguring the Goddess, Upon a Burning Body, Abacab, and Rose Funeral, among many others. Oh yes, and of course, Acacia. You remember the song with that line in it? And this is also when the super technical Sumerian core bands started to pop up, with a few early examples being like Within the Ruins, After the Burial, and Beneath the Massacre. But what I loved about this era was the culture as much as the music. And I was a lot older than these kids at the time, so I was really more of like an observer than a participant. But to me, it just seemed like it was, I guess for lack of a better word, fun, in a way that heavy music really typically wasn't. And, you know, in hindsight, it's obvious why the metal establishment hated this stuff. I mean, compare this to this. Like if you're some 34-year-old death metal guy in cargo shorts and a Nile shirt that takes himself super seriously, you see these kids in their neon cartoon monster shirts moshing in a kitchen to these ridiculous songs that make no sense. Of course they hated it. And like I said, I was a lot older than these kids, but I've just never been the guy to hate on what the younger generation is doing, so I was stoked on it. I very fondly remember spending hours on MySpace going through top 8s trying to discover cool new bands. And of course, watching all those
top 10 deathcore breakdowns that go hard and make you say OMG
videos that some kid made in Windows Movie Maker with like the aerial titles fading in between songs that are still up on YouTube in all their 240p glory. Is it even a real deathcore video if it's not in 240p?
Suck my dick!
And in terms of commercial success, nobody was getting rich off of deathcore yet, but there were some bands that were starting to get some like respectable commercial success. Bring Me the Horizon, even though they weren't technically deathcore by that point, I would consider them part of this scene, and they went to the top 20 in both the US and the UK. Suicide Silence's No Time to Bleed went to number 32 on Billboard, which I would consider pretty damn good for a band that heavy. Whitechapel's A New Era of Corruption went to number 43, and there were plenty of other bands that may not have been charting, but were definitely moving a lot of merch. The train had definitely left the station, but deathcore's commercial peak was still a couple years away.
I mean, all core is bad, but deathcore is just horrible music.
Which brings us to the deathcore 3.0 era, from roughly 2011 to 2015. And if I was to sum this era up, it would be deathcore grows up. As you can see from the chart, the community had moved to Facebook and Tumblr with the demise of MySpace, and also the audience was a little bit more metal and a little bit less scene. The scene thing in general kind of died during this era.
Hey guys, it's Alex, so welcome back to 2009.
And although it was the commercial peak, in hindsight, I think it was the beginning of the end creatively. The two bands that led the pack commercially would be Suicide Silence and Whitechapel again, and I also think that they represent the two biggest stylistic changes in the genre as well. Suicide Silence released The Black Crown in 2011, and although it wasn't mainstream, it was pretty damn big. It went to like number 28, I think. And musically, it was a lot different than their previous albums. It was a lot less chaotic, the songs were slower, less complex, and importantly, they started to bring in the nu metal influences. And remember, this was 10 years ago. Back then, it really wasn't cool to like nu metal like it is now. And then in 2014, Whitechapel's Our Endless War came out and hit number 14 on Billboard. Easily the genre's commercial peak, and honestly, in hindsight, kind of mind-blowing that a deathcore band ever charted that high. And just like Suicide Silence, their music had gotten slower, less complex, less breakdowns. Some like djenty, nu metal-y kind of sounds were coming in. Which, like I said, I think was reflective of where the genre as a whole was going. Like, I remember seeing After the Burial with, I think, Winds of Plague in like 2011, and thinking, wow, did every deathcore band just discover Meshuggah this year? And the answer is yes. Yes, they did.
These people can't even play. They just know how to do breakdowns. It's like dun 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 dun.
Which brings us to the deathcore 4.0 era, from roughly 2016 to now. If we pull up the chart, you can see the big developments here. The whole like scene kid thing is long gone, totally dead. Now the deathcore audience is pretty much entirely made up of metal dudes on Reddit and YouTube. And I specifically say metal dudes for a reason, because back during the scene era, there were actually kind of a lot of girls that were into this stuff, and that is definitely not the case anymore. Kind of a sausage party now.
I'm not here asking a question, because I know the answer to this. Deathcore is metal.
I think basically what's happened is that deathcore has finally become part of metal. It's no longer its own thing, which is fine, but I do personally feel like a lot of what made it special and interesting during the MySpace era is kind of gone. And it's also clearly past its commercial peak. To use Whitechapel again as an example, they went to number 10 in 2014, but their most recent album in 2019 peaked at number 143, despite being honestly a really good record. And yes, for all of you who are telling me that there's still tons of great deathcore bands around, I am aware. You've got the slamcore bands like Ingested and Within Destruction, and I talked about this stuff in more detail in my slam video if you want to hear more about that. I'm not really a fan, but I get it. And then there's all the down-tempo bands, which are pretty much doing a modern version of what the Acacia strain pioneered back in 2002, 2003. Spite, Black Tongue, Traitors, all that stuff. And the like tech deathcore bands. Shadow of Intent, Slaughter to Prevail, Enterprise Earth, Brand of Sacrifice, all that stuff. I'd say this is probably the closest thing to like pure deathcore these days. And then there's the blackened deathcore bands. For example, Carnifex, who have been around forever, but more recently evolved into this sound. And of course, Lorna Shore. And although there's a small but very, very dedicated, loyal following for this stuff, just kind of doesn't do it for me personally. It's not bad, there's nothing really like wrong with it, just kind of makes me go, eh. And judging by the numbers relative to its commercial peak, the market agrees with me.
All you hear is breet, 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 breet.
Which brings me to the next section. What happened? What killed deathcore? Well, I think it really comes down to two things. First of all, Mitch Lucker's death in 2012. He was by far the genre's biggest star. In fact, I would say really the genre's only star, aside from Ollie Sykes, who obviously had moved on from deathcore years before that. And I think it's very, very hard for a genre to survive when it loses its biggest personality. For example, grunge pretty much died in 1994 with Kurt Cobain. Or emo rap, as much as I love that stuff and I want it to be the next big thing, honestly, I kind of think it died with Peep. It really takes the wind out of a genre's sails when you lose the person who was steering the ship.
How do you run back here and steer this boat?
Mitch's personality was something the deathcore scene really, really needed, something that's been missing since then. He was just a genuinely nice, welcoming, likable guy that brought in a much larger fan base than you might expect for such harsh music. Like he brought a lot of younger kids and girls in, and because of that, losing him, I think, really severely limited the genre's audience.
You want to tell me about your lemonade?
My lemonade is very particular, Cameron.
And secondly, I think by the deathcore 3.0 era, the bands had mostly lost sight of what made the genre special in the first place as far as the music goes. Whereas during the MySpace years, it was just kids who didn't give a fuck doing whatever they wanted, just going for it. By the 3.0 era, I think they'd gotten a lot more conservative and uptight. They were trying way hard to be technical, to be good music, and to please the metal establishment and gatekeepers. And I think it really limited their creativity.
All those fucking bands just sound the same. All deathcore sounds the same.
And also the production, it's just so sterile. Modern deathcore is just so ridiculously fake that even to me, someone who has no problem with things like editing and sample replacement, a lot of it is so overproduced that I just can't listen to it. It just sounds so robotic and inhuman. And lastly, the culture. I'm not really sure how this happened, but the deathcore fandom now can be very toxic and elitist, a lot of gatekeeping, very unwelcoming and hostile, which is very ironic to me considering how hated the genre was during the MySpace years, but hey, I guess that's the scene circle of life, right?
You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
And so because of all that, I think deathcore kind of dug its own grave. And I think the younger generation who would have gotten into deathcore 12 or 15 years are now getting into other genres instead. In particular, either like aggressive bass music or trap metal. Stuff like this. Or this.
missile. Riding up close range, I can't miss you.
To me, it's 100% clear that something like City Morgue is the new deathcore. So ultimately, I think deathcore killed itself, just like a lot of genres do. But although deathcore as a genre may not be what it once was, the spirit is alive and well. There's still kids in their bedrooms making the most absurd, over-the-top, aggressive shit they possibly can and pissing everybody off in the process. And that is something I will always back, regardless of what genre you put on it.
Have you ever heard of I Wrestled the Bear once, and Whitechapel, and all that fucking shit? It's not even riffs, it's just scratching on the guitar like...
Alright guys, that does it for What Killed Deathcore. That was a long one, hopefully you enjoyed it. I had a lot to say about it. And before you jump in the comments and tell me that actually deathcore is alive and well, it's bigger than ever, look at the numbers before you do that, and I think you'll find that you're mistaken. But before I let you go, I want to thank everyone who supports us on Patreon at the True Cult level or above. It is because of your support that we've been able to get the podcast off the ground, so I'm very sincerely, genuinely grateful to everybody who supports us on Patreon. It is because of your support that I was able to hire a producer and editor to get the show going. You can find out more about that at the link in the description. Also, make sure you check out the Punk Rock NBA podcast live now on all platforms. And if you made it this far, I'm going to throw out one more thing. Add me on LinkedIn. There's a link to that in the description too. I'm going hard on LinkedIn. So if you are into business, add me on there. Let's talk. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.